recording for Collin, and we're playing him a video, right? So this is just kind of a mashup almost of the two conventions side by side, and it just gives you a feeling again for what conventions are. What did I say they're a vehicle for?
Momentum.
Momentum.
Unification.
Unification, right? And getting out what? I mean, this is the only substantive thing it does.
The vote?
Well, yeah, because that's, you know, you're going to have this highly televised.
Is it party agenda?
Yeah, getting your party agenda out there. This is a platform for you to give all these speeches, right? And to get your message out there. And that in turn ideally unifies after the pre-election elections and gets you that momentum, right? So here's your mashup.
I humbly
As it is with humility
and gratefully
and boundless confidence
accept
your nomination
for the presidency
of the United States.
Here's the zealous.
God bless the United States of America.
If you want someone to fight for you and your country, I can assure you, he's the guy.
And she is still the best darn change maker I have ever known.
Vote for Donald Trump, for a safer America, and for an America headed in a different direction. Greatness!
There has never been a man or a woman, not me, not Bill, nobody, more qualified than Hillary Clinton to serve as President of the United States of America.
He's a man known for a large personality, a colorful style, and lots of charisma, and so I guess he was just looking for some balance on the ticket.
We're gonna destroy ISIS so fast, believe me. There's nothing suspicious in my tax returns, believe me.
That this is the moment, and Donald Trump is the person to make America great again.
I know with all my heart that my mother will make us proud as our next president.
I am your voice.
Don't let anyone tell you that our country is weak. We're not.
I will restore law and order to our country.
Really? I alone can fix it?
My message is that things have to change, and they have to change right now.
Americans don't say, I alone can fix it. We say, we'll fix it together.
So, again, you see in some of this, those themes, the idea of getting your platform out there, unifying people around that platform and gaining the momentum. But you also saw, again, in a highly televised event, how little things, like, I noticed just even when Obama was talking about nobody, not Bill, not me, nobody, and he kind of had his like southern drawl there, it kind of like sticks, right? We look at the gaffes. This is as much of an opportunity to gaffe, to make a mistake, and then that becomes part of the news cycle, and we use that to kind of like, again, we like simple, and making a mistake is a real good reason to move away from somebody. So here's kind of a history of gaffes. You've got appropriate music, right?
That's the picture that the president and his people want very much.
Remember, you're supposed to have balloons.
Oh, that's just sad.
It's better than no balloons.
And the party of a great man who should have been president, who would have been one of the greatest presidents in history, give us Horatio Honto.
One's lower. Oh no.
You went literary.
Even though we know that 80% of the workforce in the year 2000 is already working, and we know that when workers can't read, eventually they'll have to pay for it, and we will too.
Bill Clinton now is seriously in oversight. He's only about halfway through his prepared text, and he should have been done about 5 minutes ago because it was scheduled to go only 20.
I can tell you that this place is just ready to explode, and I think that they're long past the period, Tom, of listening to Governor Bill Clinton.
Well, let us show you a wide shot how the convention hall is seen of Al Gore banners. I don't know what Joe Biden, well, it is past my time. We're getting into it here.
Thank you. But you thought the war in Afghanistan was okay. I mean, you thought that was something that was worth doing. We didn't check with the Russians to see how they did there for the 10 years. What do you mean, shut up? Okay.
So
That's like all the frustration.
that's kind of a brief sampling of those awkward moments, and what it becomes is often the kiss of death. I'm going to play for you guys later. It's in a different unit, but I don't know if you know who Howard Dean is. He was a candidate that had won or done well in Iowa, and he was going on to New Hampshire. And he proceeded to kind of talk about the other places that the next primaries were, and we're going to do great there. So he starts this resuscitation of states. And he just gets super excited as he's talking about, we're going here, we're going here, we're going here, and then he gives a yeah! And as he does that, his political career died. Because literally he looked a little unhinged. That was it. Somehow, that rule of politics does not seem to apply to Donald J. Trump, to be honest with you, because there were gaffes and moments where you thought that was it, and it never was it. So I think it indicates, again, the gaffes often kill people because we like simple. And if somebody doesn't look presidential or it can't be mistake-free, well, they're not presidential, right? So there is obviously some other kind of undercurrent, something about economics or cultural upheaval or a populist movement that causes people to overlook that. And I do think that that's significant. I'm not ready to kind of define the trend and let you know if it's a new normal, but really was interesting in that all the conventional rules of politics did not seem to apply.
I think it was because people really wanted that outsider from Washington, and I think Trump continuing to gaff it. People like
reinforce that idea. Yeah, that's who I want. I don't want that polished insider. And again, there's what gets you elected, and often we want an outsider, but then there's what is successful governance, and that's an insider.
Yeah, I think we wanted him to stop gaffing at this point.
They talked about the pivot, that kind of famous pivot to putting down the Twitter account and becoming more of that statesman, right? Okay, so at any rate, that was, we'll see if I kind of make up time here. That was kind of to finalize the definition of, in general, what do the parties do, but you also have to kind of understand the evolution of the parties. What I think is important in terms of a takeaway are two things. This shows, here's one kind of evolution of a party. This shows kind of in simple terms, the evolution of the parties. And over here you have this kind of swirl of third parties. Again, political scientists aren't going to make their money if they don't make this more complicated. So instead of kind of creating 2, 3, you could argue maybe 4 party systems, they've come up with 6, right? Do I have to remember all 6? Not entirely. What you want to remember is the rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is what caused people to kind of pivot from one party system to another. What would you guess? Some kind of big event, right? Some sort of crisis, some sort of seismic change, and that's what you want to. You want to more be able to look to illustrate that. The other thing I think you want to be able to take away is there is some continuity here. In particular, you could argue that there's continuity with the Democratic Party. They go from the Democratic Republicans to the Democratic Party, and there's certain things in the party's DNA. Same thing with the Republican Party. There's certain things in their DNA that help you define what the party stands for in a broader sense. You know, issues change, candidates kind of change the party. What was the basic structure and backbone of that party? And that will help you define who you are and what you stand for. So I think those are the two things that value. All right, first party system. And you could see it on the, you know, this first slide. We've got Federalist, and again, there were Federalist and Anti-Federalist, but were those political parties? No. That had more to do with, you know, ratifying the Constitution, right? The Federalists, you know, evolved into a political party, and the opposition evolved more into the Democratic Republicans. And you guys have studied this in US 1. Maybe I got more detail up here than you need, but the Federalists are led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They're about a strong central government. Again, Adams is kind of famous for talking about democracy is for election day, and then let the government govern. And the people have had their kind of say. They want a strong economy largely so that they can promote a manufacturing-based economy that happens to be centered in the kind of New England states, in the Northeast. So oftentimes it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. Do they support the policy because of the constituency, or does the constituency support the party because of the issue? Does that make sense? Right? They go hand in glove. Democratic Republicans just kind of do it in the converse, right? You got Jefferson leading it. They are looking more as like a states' rights kind of party, in that they feel like that's the best way to safeguard against a concentration and thus abuse of power. Jefferson believed that if every person was a gentleman farmer and they owned land, they'd be invested in the country and willing to defend it and its interests. So it's a safeguard against you know, an abuse of power, and it's a way to kind of you know, get people to kind of be invested citizens, right? Because he's supporting the idea of land ownership and smaller government, he becomes kind of the party of the agrarian South, right? So these are our two parties, and again, you know the backdrop of it. Today's Democratic Party is a descendant of Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. And they had kind of this tumultuous you know, conflict between the two parties. Again, we've talked about it several times. You know, in the election of 1796, how they're running as political parties, but you know, leaders of political parties, but we're not voting in the Electoral College along party lines. So they become the two top vote getters that become put in that really weird political marriage as president and vice president. And then when they do have running mates, the ballots fail to specify that. We vote this time along party lines, but too zealously, one of the delegates forgets to kind of hold his ballot back, and as a result, it looks like a tie between Jefferson and his running mate. And we go into who does the tiebreaker? The House, right? For president. What do we do for the VP? Senate. That's in the Senate, right? So we go through that tiebreaker, and you can bring back in Aaron Burr and the famous kind of, you know, slander and slurs that they threw back at each other. The eventual passage of the 12th Amendment. All of that is interesting things. It's all really interesting, but we often miss the bigger kind of picture. You had two kind of, they were friends at first, that became kind of bitter political rivals. And one has to pass power over to his political opposite. The person that is all about strong central government is going to hand it to that states' writer kind of, you know, individual. And yet we do that, again, Burr gets shot, or Hamilton gets shot, but we do it in a bloodless way, other than that, right? Yeah. It's known as the Revolution of 1800. It is massive, right? But it may be the kind of the advent of all our political woes, right? Because here come political parties in spite of what Washington warned us against. So, what happens? Well, you mentioned war, right? Take crisis. War of 1812 is what kills the Federalist Party. So again, it's just general rule of thumb. What causes us to seismically shift? Well, in this case, questioning a war is tricky. Can you be patriotic and question a war?
Yeah.
Yeah, but does it look that way?
No.
No. Because we often kind of mix up, you know, not necessarily supporting the troops, not necessarily being patriotic in our allegiance to our country. Maybe we're kind of seen as like taking a soft approach to our adversaries. So the Federalists take a kind of hard line against the War of 1812, and a lot of it is for economic reasons, right? This is a war against Britain, and that is New England's largest trading partner. So some go as far in the Hartford Convention to suggest the secession of New England states. And then when you have the kind of the surprising victory / non-victory in the Battle of New Orleans, man, did they look bad. So not supporting the war in the right way is what causes them to go away. And what we have for this, amazing period of time is essentially a one-party system in a sense. That party label didn't entirely matter. It's called the era of good feelings. One of the dullest events to teach too as a result. So for a while we have economic prosperity, there's no really divisive issues, and essentially kind of there's one party dominance until 4 people essentially with the same party run against each other, including John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. That's one of our first instances where, what kind of vote does Jackson win?
Plurality.
So he wins the popular vote by a plurality, but he does not win the Electoral College, right? It's essentially the requisite amount, right? So he's got to get the majority of the electoral votes. He doesn't get it. Where do we go? House, right? There were 4 candidates, but they only considered the top 3 kind of vote getters. And you have multiple ballots, and eventually you have the corrupt bargain. Remember, where the House essentially agrees to throw it potentially to John Quincy Adams in exchange for a little kickback. Again, what you've got is Henry Clay getting a better position within there, okay? So this is kind of the next crisis point in a sense, because you've got a populist movement. Jackson was seen as a man of the people, and he is essentially in diametric opposition to John Quincy Adams, who is about using the power of the federal government to begin to kind of expand our national infrastructure. Not a particularly exciting topic, but that's essentially what we're looking at. Man of the people versus someone who looks more like a federalist who wants to expand national infrastructure. Question?
So it's at this point we start getting the first bits of modern iconography for the parties, because Andrew Jackson, he's Jackson's Democrats. The reason the Democrats have a donkey today.
We'll get to the Copperheads and so that's Thomas Nast, and we're going to look at some of those images.
Because you would draw the Republican Party as an elephant.
Right.
And then I heard that people would call Jackson a jackass.
Yep.
He kind of ran with that.
Kind of liked it, on some level, make that a badge of honor. Again, what you're going to begin to see is, like I said, these 2 forces. Jackson is on some level, he's about the common man. He comes in as someone who's going to protect the common man by scaling down government, supposedly, right? In particular, what doesn't he like that he keeps, he doesn't renew the charter of? The banks, right? The national banks, because that's all pro New England kind of northeastern states, and it's antagonistic towards kind of the western states, right? So he's coming in kind of, on this wave of democratic reform where states are dropping property requirements and other voting requirements. There's about 3 times as many people that are able to vote. He's championing, it seems, their interest. We've had a reform of the nomination system. It used to be more like superdelegates picking their nominee in a back, smoke-filled room. It was called King Caucus, and now we're using more of the kind of the primary system that you guys are familiar with. But how does he rule? And I say rule. How does he govern?
Well, his criticizers essentially said he ruled with an iron fist,
Yeah.
essentially.
So again, it gives you these kind of 2 images. Again, not a dizzying amount of vetoes, but it is when you consider that he used the veto more than his predecessors combined. He was using it when he felt like he didn't like something politically as opposed to constitutionally, right? He's willing to use force against, the states that said we're not paying tariffs. It's a tariff of abominations, and we have a right of state nullification. Well, I'm going to use force against you. He's willing to use force to relocate the Native Americans. So, and you could see some of the autocratic nature in his approach to the banks. So, at any rate, there's this, you know, he comes in as one figure, but he's often seen as the other, King Angel. And this is where that iconic kind of images that you're talking about, right? So this, he in a sense is the crisis for the next kind of party system in a sense, because he is seen as this by many, and here comes the next political party, which is largely just in opposition to him. The Whigs are actually a political party that ties back to the British Whigs. And they were not against the king, but they were opposition party to the king, in part because he actually started to lose his mental facilities. Real quick, you know, if you have, like, this is kind of a fun movie, it may be a little dated, but this is, you know, all you guys know King George for is he was the king during the American Revolution, right? But we don't follow him much after that, because USA number one, we won, right? He loses his mind, you know, following the American Revolution. This is a little bit of historic fiction, but
King George entered the 28th year of his glorious reign.
I wish you the best of health, Father. Wish me, you wish me death, you plump little cuckoo.
It was an age of nobility.
Mrs. King.
Mr. King. A time of harmony. You're a good little woman, Mrs. King. We have been happy. It was a monarchy destined to endure.
Stop! Long live the king!
But destiny would have to wait.
Mind your own business.
He was all-powerful.
Your Majesty would just lift your leg.
And the king, you lift my leg. All-knowing. Colonies.
They're now called the United States.
Goodness me.
What don't they
But he wasn't quite all there.
Hello there, Georgie boy.
I want you to hand over Gibraltar to Spain and see if you can get Minorca in return. I'm a physician, sir. Well, then you should have no difficulty. What would happen if the king were ill?
Her Royal Highness would have to declare regent, king in all but name. Is he?
He's not well.
His Majesty is just a man. His Majesty is out of his mind. It's unthinkable.
Do you think that you're mad? I hear the words, so I have to speak.
I was given to understand you might be able to cure His Majesty. Well, I can cure him, Mr. King.
I'm just not sure what's wrong. I make the weather by means of mental powers.
The king is incapacitated.
If a few colonists in America can send him packing, why can't we?
He is to rule in your place. By whose authority? Now is the time, Charles.
Give us the wisdom of America. From the award-winning director of Miss Saigon, the Samuel Goldwyn Company presents a story
He's not something he is.
about a time of grace, grandeur, and the delicate balance of power.
What you're paid for?
The madness of King George.
How is Your Majesty? Fat lot you care. Not saying the king. So.
So, I don't know if that has appeal for you, but it does explain in part where the name, the party, the Whigs came from, and why in part that name was adopted.
You just go back because he was like several generations inbred.
Yeah, it's part of it. Yeah, that's that certainly could play a role, right? That they weren't careful with kind of bloodlines, that the family mattered more than the genetics of it, the pool. So at any rate, this is how the Whigs come upon the scene. But what's interesting is when Jackson leaves the scene, that aura that surrounded the Democratic Republicans kind of faded a little bit. And these two parties were pretty much evenly matched until next crisis, slavery, right? And the looming Civil War. And that's going to lead to our next kind of shuffle, which I'll get to really quickly. The advent of the Republican Party, which you guys know from your history, really starts as kind of this amalgam of different groups and eventually coalesces around the Republican Party in their anti-slavery position. What they did, again, the men is the Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party kind of obviously powerful because the Democrats took one half of that party and one half of really Jefferson's identity, and the Republicans took the other half. You know, there's the Jefferson that was the states' writer, right? And the guy about, you know, avoiding a strong central government because that leads to an abuse of power. But there's also the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, and the guy that's about liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all of that. So each kind of takes half the persona and half the name. What's kind of funny is the Republican Party is also known as the grand or gallant old party, and that's meant derisively. Remember the chart, the Democrats were around for the longest, and then here come the Republicans, these Johnny-come-latelys. And as a result, they get the derisive name, which the Republicans held on to, is the GOP. And as you mentioned, Thomas Nast does the political cartoons that help kind of personify them and their personalities. And that's how we get to Democrats and Republicans. If the Republicans are the party that are anti-slavery, then by definition, the Democrats become, a party that is going to be split by this issue, but will eventually kind of, in terms of their identity, cling to that agrarian kind of interest, right? And you're going to see that, the Republicans will dominate for quite some time until you have your next kind of crisis, right? The Republican Party is going to, win the whole series of elections. The progressive movement comes along and both pick up progressives. Both use party machines to kind of pull people to them. The Democratic Party is largely the agrarian party of the South, and it's going to support their interests. Racial tensions kind of play a role, but they'll also, through party machines in the progressive movement, start picking up middle-class urbanites, right? What's the next crisis that kind of catapults the Democratic Party to dominance?
The Great Depression.
Great Depression, right? So we did get to almost where I need to. We'll get to the fourth, and you see the kind of the transition we're going to do to the fifth here, right? All right, we'll put a pin in it.